Okay, perfect timing. Okay, well, good morning to all of you, and thanks so much for your presence here this morning. I know we have some online too, so thanks to all who've taken the time to be here this morning. My name's Kent Lovern. I'm a Christ Church parishioner, and along with my wife, Susan, we've been parishioners here for about 20 years or so. My day job is at the DA's office. I've been there for over 25 years now. I'm the chief deputy DA, so my job is to run the daily operations of the place. We have 300 staff members in 2 locations, and then what I always say is the fun part of my job is that I get to work on initiatives in the community related to trying to prevent crime. So you'll see at some point we'll talk a little bit about how I got involved in Sojourner and what that ultimately led to and why we see this as a really important public health, public safety asset here in Milwaukee.
Good morning, and thanks to all of you for coming in to hear us this morning. Sorry, I forgot to turn. I thought my voice was projecting enough. Can you hear me now? Better. All right. All right. Good morning again. Thank you all for coming, for being here to hear us. I'm Dolly Johnson, and I'm kind of new to Christ Church. Started here 2021, and already they got me involved with doing presentation. I don't know who volunteered me, but that's okay. I'm doing it. I'm here. That's part of God's work. I used to be an employee of Sojourner, and now I'm volunteering sort of by helping them fundraise for the shelter, which is a passion and dear to my heart, by doing the Taste of Africa, which I did last year and hope to do this year and next year and so forth. And for those in here that were there, thank you for coming. And this year, all of you, please come. I had to do a little pitch for that.
So what we thought we'd do today is, because Dolly, in my view, we've worked together for many, many years. I'm a huge admirer of Dolly's, of course, and she, if you saw in the weekly bulletin, was with Sojourner for 36 years and really spanned the majority of the time Sojourner has existed. And so what I thought we would do is, you can see we have a PowerPoint. We're not going to stick too much to that. I picked up a number of things from Carmen Petrie that she uses around the community, and I've spliced a few things together, but we won't be too tied to that for now. What I'd really like is, I think it'd be great to hear from Dolly first, and so we'll do it kind of conversationally. We'll just have a seat here, and we'll just chat back and forth, and you can hear about Dolly's story, because I think it's so interwoven with Sojourner and the work in this community, and then her work and the development, and then we'll pick up to 10 or 12 years ago when we decided to expand things.
Change,
okay,
yes.
and then we'll get to the PowerPoint a little bit. Okay, have a seat. You need your tea or you're good? Okay. All right. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? You're from Liberia originally?
Yes. Originally from Liberia, West Africa, and people always ask me what brought you. It's still not on?
Get a hold of it a little closer.
Oh, closer? Okay. Here. All right. And people always ask me, well, what brought you to Milwaukee or to the United States? And so I tell them I came here to go to school. I wanted to study social work, and that wasn't being offered in Liberia. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah,
okay.
Maybe
all right, I got to
turn your chair a little. That way. This way. Yeah. Way everyone can see you.
Okay. Okay. All right. Gotcha. I'll try to remember that because I keep thinking you can hear me without this mic. So I wanted to study social work, and that wasn't being offered in any school or program in Liberia. And so my parents, who were being very supportive, said, if you want to study social work, you can go to choose a school anywhere and we'll support you. And of course, me not thinking it through correctly, I said, oh, I'm just going to go to school in France. I want to go to Paris. And so I started telling all my friends I'm going to go to school in Paris. And they said, do you know how to speak French fluently? And I said, no. Well, then, how are you going to go to school there? I said, oh, that's right. That means I have to learn it first. And then I said, no, I don't want to do all of that. So then my mom said, look, just find a school. She was a very straightforward person. Find a school in America, somewhere in America. So then I wanted to go to California because I heard wonderful stories about California. I said, I got to go there. And of course, she stopped that process. Where are you going to go? I said, California. No. And it's like, what's wrong with California? And all she could say was, by the time I fly from Monrovia, Liberia, which Monrovia is the capital, to New York, and then New York to California, I hate flying. I'll be a dead person by then. So she said, and I have to come and visit and see how you're doing. So come find a school on the East Coast or Midwest. And so when I checked, because they went to school on the East Coast, Columbia, my dad was the first Liberian to graduate from Harvard Law School. And so for the lawyers in here, they can relate. And so I applied to, not Harvard now, I applied to Columbia. He went there also after Harvard. He did a master's there. And then my mom went to NYU, so I applied there. But unfortunately, they told me that I couldn't come then. I had to wait until the next semester. And by then, I was like raring to go because all my friends knew I was going somewhere for school, so I had to go somewhere. And so someone told me about Milwaukee, which I didn't know anything about, and so said, why don't you apply to Milwaukee? So I applied to UWM. And when I did, then I started telling people, and they said, you're going to freeze in Milwaukee. Don't you know it snows a lot? And I said, I just can't win. You know, everywhere has an issue. And so I said, well, I'll just have to go with wherever. And then I started praying, Lord, please don't let Milwaukee be the first to say come, and Milwaukee was the first to say come. And so my mom said, okay, if we are sponsoring you, you got to go. So I came. And after I got here, this was the fall of 78, and it was that terrible, terrible winter snowstorm, 78, 79. I had never seen snow before in my life, and it's like, oh my God, the people were not lying. They said I would freeze, and I am going to freeze in this place. Snow up to, oh my goodness. Anyway, it was, my dad came after the first semester to see how I was faring in all this snow. I mean, he had experienced it already, but I hadn't. And so we walked from UWM. I was renting from a professor and his wife that lived on the east side, not far from the International Students Office on Shepherd. So we walked from the house there to the university because he wanted to see truly how is she doing. I would send my grades back because they were sponsoring me, so I felt they needed to see how I was doing. But he wanted to also connect with some of the professors because my mom asked him to do that, not so much him. So, and the reason she was doing that, she wanted to push me now towards doing, when she's all done with everything, then I want her to do a PhD. It's like, what? Wait a minute. So then I said, well, when I'm all done, I want to find a job. And this is where I started looking. My mom said, you will not just hang around the United States and travel. I was traveling, trying to see and visit places I hadn't been. And she said, enough of the traveling around. If you can, you either go back to school or you come home. But you're not going to be hanging around America doing nothing. And so, and so then I said, okay, then I will just find a job. So I started looking. And everybody was telling me, no experience. And it's like, how will I get experience if nobody's willing to hire me? So then I saw this job, and I'm really dating myself because back then people looked in the Milwaukee Journal, for example, for jobs and so forth, and that's what I did. I saw the job in the Milwaukee Journal for a family advocate, Sojourner Truth House. And I was like, wow, you know, I'm a social worker. I can do that. And so I said, I will apply for it. I don't care what all these other people say. No experience. I'm applying for this job. So I did. And when I applied for the job, I didn't hear anything. And then after a while, I said, let me call and find out what is happening with this job. So when I called and I got the executive director at the time, she said, this job is for someone who has a master's degree. And I said, in social work, and I said, I do have that. And so she said, I'm looking. She didn't find my resume. So then as she was about to, I guess I thought, oh, okay, I sent the wrong resume because I had resumes say one for counseling, one for social work, everything going, and I sent the one for counseling. And she was looking for social workers. And so then she said, oh, I see. You send the resume saying you have a master's in counseling. And I said, yes, but I do have a master's in social work too. And so she said, okay, let me just set up the appointment for you to come in for an interview since you're already on the phone. We set it up for 9 o'clock, I think like 2 or 3 days later. Of course, in my process of looking for work, guess what? I had gotten hooked on watching soap opera. Thanks to my wonderful roommate. And all my children used to come on at 9 o'clock. So I said, oh my God. After the appointment was set up, I said, oh, I will miss all my children. I have to watch that episode tomorrow. So I said, what am I going to do? I called her back and I said, Mrs. McShane, do you think that we could reschedule? I said, because I forgot I have this prior engagement. And I lied, In a way, I lied. I have this prior engagement, so I need to reschedule. Is that possible? And she said, yes, we can reschedule, and we did. So then I was able to watch all my children, and then go to my interview. And who interviewed me? Claudette McShane and Kathy Stokman. Michael Stokman. I will stop right there and go back a little bit, because now here is my connection with Sojourner. Sojourner, and before that, I didn't even know much about Sojourner. I had heard a little bit, here and there from school, but I didn't know much about it, except that it had started from the grassroots movement, and some women that were doing their masters at UWM from the School of Social Welfare were manning the only hotline that was in the city at the time, and they were hearing women say that they were being abused, they were being hurt, they were afraid, they were suffering, they didn't have anywhere to go, they didn't know what to do, and so forth. So they got concerned. And so these group of women got together and discussed and talked about it. By then, there was no shelter anywhere really. And then the first one was in Austin, Texas. That is really where the National Domestic Violence Hotline number is housed out of Austin, Texas. And so that's where the first one was. And so they reached out to them and started to mobilize people in Milwaukee in terms of the older people and the mayor and all these people, and got together, had these meetings, and really started to involve the community at large. And Sojourner has always been good with that in terms of involving and trying to involve the community in this huge issue that we have, domestic violence. And so they were able to get some grants together that were given to them, and they said, now we need to finalize location. And so they found a house. Back then, there was a hospital called Family Hospital that used to be on Wells and close to 27 and Wells, it was. And they had a duplex on like 31st in Wisconsin. And so they rented that out to Sojourner for little of nothing. And so that was the first home of the shelter, the first domestic violence shelter in Milwaukee was right there. And so then, that's where Claudette invited me to come to do my interview. And I went there, did my interview, and never worked out of that house. Because at the same time, because they had been in operation for a few years, they had quickly outgrown that space. And they knew that they had to go somewhere else. So they had been looking all around the city for someplace else that was going to be bigger. And according to Claudette, they went around to 33rd and Highland, and there was this duplex that was for sale. No, a four-family dwelling that was for sale. And so when she saw it, she said she immediately thought, this is going to be the home of the Sojourner Truth House shelter. And that's where it was. So again, they mobilized the community, got everybody involved, got funding and so forth, and they had to redo that house, that apartment complex, so that it will be a shelter. I wish we had the thing, but anyway, we'll point it out when it shows.
Yeah, I can find the slide for you.
The old shelter. Yeah. And so the old shelter was on 33rd and Highland.
Here it
And
is.
that's the new
Here it
one.
is. Here it is.
Yeah, that's the old shelter. That's the one I started working in. So when they redid it, they had 10 bedrooms, 3 downstairs, and the rest were upstairs. So upstairs and downstairs. So I say that because I'm going to reference the new shelter, and contrast the difference between the old and the new a little bit real quickly. So that one was upstairs. It could accommodate, first it started off with 35, then it went to 36, 38 women and children. And the reason why the 10 rooms could hold so many people was because we had bunk beds in that. Now, the bunk beds seemed to work for a while, when we were doing that. And so it had its pluses and it had minuses. One of the minuses was that it kept us from bringing in, for example, women that were pregnant, or all women that needed to come in that were pregnant. And the reason why, if all the bottom bunks were taken, then a pregnant woman could not be put in the upper bunk. So then that ruled her out from coming into Sojourner. So that was a problem right there for not only the agency, but also for the community at large. So then we are in this, so I got hired and I started in the shelter. There was a big change, in fact, before I even started, and that was why my position became available. There were like 5 women's advocates, and I think 3 or 4 children's advocates working in the shelter, this shelter. And Michael Stoltman, I don't know if there's anyone in this room who's ever heard of Michael Stoltman. He was an Episcopalian priest and was a canon in the diocese and was on the board of Sojourner. In fact, he was vice president of the board, and he was one of the people that hired me. He and one of the founding women, Claudette McSheen, who became the executive director. And I remember, real quick, going back to the interview, during the interview, they said that there were tons of people for this one job. And so that made me very nervous, when I found out later on. So then it came down to 7 people, and then it came down to 2, another lady and myself. And we went to the interview, the final round, and I remember back at school, people that were graduating before me were saying, they were getting these social work jobs, and they were making 18, 19, 20, 22, and I'm thinking, I can hardly wait so I can make 18, 19, or 22. So when I started, little did I know when I started, then I said, okay, no one has said anything about how much this job is paying. And so then Claudette said, $14,000. And I said to myself, oh. And out loud I did say, oh. And so she said, is that a problem? And I'm thinking really quick, okay, I've traveled a long way to get here. Many knows. Now it's down to me and someone else. If I say no to this job, they're going to give it to her. And I'm thinking real quick in my head, I'm calculating, well, I'm single, it's only me, I can make this work and work my way up. And so I said, no, there's no problem, none at all. I can work with that. And so then I was offered a job. Even though I was disappointed it was $14,000, I was happy to get the job. And 1, to get my mom off my back. And 2, to be working and doing something that I thought I would really, 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 really like. And that is social work and doing something with domestic violence. Did I have any experience in that? Well, I saw a couple of instances where there was domestic violence. I didn't really think too much of it because it wasn't really on my radar that way. I spent part of my life in an orphanage, and in that orphanage there were good times and there were bad times. And I was abused, not only me, but the girls were abused by our caretaker. And we were very, very afraid of her, and we couldn't disclose. So some of the things that happened in domestic violence homes, we were experiencing then as children at the orphanage. We could not disclose what was happening to us. We could not disclose who was abusing us because we were afraid. She threatened that we would get it worse if we told, the executive director and the people above her what was happening to us and so forth. So the girls in their own building, the boys in their own building, the boys, well, we're all in the same building, but it was a big building divided. So the boys in one wing, the girls in one wing, and the babies in the middle. So the boys, felt bad for us because they had the sweetest, nicest woman taking care of them. And we had, oh my goodness, a horrible woman taking care of us. She was so mean. And we called her Mama. The other one was called Auntie B. And because her name was Beatrice, so everybody called her Auntie B. This one we call Mama because we're afraid of her. When everybody said Mama, we all said Mama. And not knowing that when Mama went on her weekends, she would be abused by her boyfriend or significant other, and she would come back, and then we got the brunt of that. But at the time we were little, we didn't know all of that. Later on, then we were hearing things from eavesdropping from the older people. We were hearing, that Mama was being beaten by her boyfriend. So then, that was my introduction to a little bit of domestic violence, which I didn't even connect it to anything until I was at UWM. And even then, it still didn't fully connect because by then they were talking about child abuse, child abuse, child abuse. And I'm walking around saying, what are they talking about, child abuse? I don't know anything about that. I've never been abused as a child. I don't know what they're talking about. And not until the end of the class, before it started to click in my head, oh, what happened to us at the orphanage was really child abuse. Even though it wasn't our parents doing it, our caretakers were abusing us. So then it's like, okay, so I still didn't, in the beginning, I didn't compute that all the marks, on my body came from what Mama inflicted on me. And so then at UWM, at the end of the course, I said, okay, these marks on my body, they're from Mama and her abuse. Of course, needless to say, when it all came out, Mama was fired, for the abuse that she was, rendering on us. So then my full connection came full circle when I started at Sojourner. So I'm working there, and I'm dating this guy from school that I went to school with. And he was a probation and parole officer, and I thought I had a catch of the day or whatever because everybody wanted to date him. He was popular, and it's like, oh, he wanted to date me. So I felt so special and whatnot. Not until I'm working at Sojourner, and then he came by there to bring something, to drop something off for me. And when he was there, he saw how I was moving around and how people were saying, oh, Dolly this, Dolly that, and he didn't like that. Okay, it still didn't click in my head right away that he was, getting jealous and he wouldn't like it. I didn't put it together yet. And so the first incident, I don't know, some stupid argument, and slapped my glasses off my face, broke it. Second incident, ripped my shirt, and we're in the street. And the third incident was when he came to my apartment, and I was rolling my hair, and he kept making all this noise. Let me in, please. I want to talk to you. Let him in. He had come from drinking. I said, oh, my God. This guy been drinking. I didn't even know he had been drinking. I let him in my apartment. I had a roommate, and she was there asleep. Came in, and he started talking as he usually would do. And all of a sudden, he got mad over what, I don't know. Because I sat there and didn't say anything. I'm just looking at him, and he's talking. And he said, you're going to sit there and look at me like that, And, of course, it set him off. And so when he hit me, and then he began to strangle me, I won't go into the details. I see some younger people here. I managed to get away from him and ran in the bathroom. And the next day, I called Kathy, who was my director at the time, and then told her that I wouldn't be able to come to work because I felt sick. And emotionally, mentally, I felt really, really ill. And I said, there's no way I can come in and be of any use to anyone. I said, but I'll explain it to you when I come tomorrow, everything. So then I had some pictures of us together. So I ripped the pictures, divided the pictures, me on one side, him, and put his in a plastic bag, and mine I left, and went to his job, his probation parole officer job, and I said, I brought something for, oh, my African name is Yimade. And he, oh, Yimade, hi. And I said, don't Yimade me. I just want to drop this off. Don't you ever call my name. Don't you ever come by me. Say anything to me, because if you ever do, I will call the police on you. I said, even though you told me if I ever reported you to the police, call police on you, or the DA's, go to the DA's office, I will never go back to Africa alive. I said, I will call the police on you. I said, so don't ever call my name, don't call my phone, nothing. And I just walked off from there and left from there and went home. The next day I went into work and then spoke to Kathy Stoopman, who was the executive director. So the first director was Claudette McSheen, and I mentioned her already. The second executive director was Kathy Stoopman, wife of Michael Stoopman. How did she get involved? She, the old shelter, this shelter had a lot of donations, clothes all over the place. Things, I mean, it was just, the basement was just disorganized. And so Michael said, I know someone who can whip this into shape in no time. And so, and he said, who? So he brought Kathy on as a volunteer. And true enough, in no time, she did put it into shape. And so then, after a year of Kathy volunteering there and me working there, Claudette said that once she was pregnant, she was going to leave and go raise her children. And so then, raise her child. And so then I'm panicking. Oh my God, who's going to mentor me? I'm new at this. And Claudette is leaving already. What am I going to do? She said, you'll be just fine. You'll be just fine. And so she left. And they had to find a new executive director. And so then the board decided that Kathy would be realizing the great work she was doing. She started to establish the fact that volunteers were needed, which they didn't have. And she said, we cannot run this without volunteers. So she brought in volunteers to reorganize the whole basement and all like that. And then we had a 24-hour hotline. And so she said, it's a small staff, and so volunteers are needed to help to run the hotline. And so then they decided that they were going to hire Kathy Stoopman as the executive director. So then I felt much better, that somebody else was going to be, that I knew was going to be moving into that position that I could, look up to. And so Michael stepped away because Kathy now was staff. And he stepped away from the board, because of conflict of interest, of course. And so then he went back to doing his work as an Episcopalian priest in the diocese. So then Kathy developed the hotline, the 24 hotline, our hotline some more in terms of the volunteers, building a huge pool of volunteers that worked in the shelter with the residents and also worked on the hotline. And what did they do on the hotline? They took the calls and screened people to come in, listen to their stories, brought them in, and so forth, helped them get situated in the shelter, explain what was going to be happening to them. So they were helping the small staff. So the staff that was like 5 advocates that I mentioned earlier and 3 children's advocates all became one person, and that became Dolly. And so that one position became Dolly's position. So then I found myself doing counseling and advocacy and doing some administrative stuff. So I was like all over the place doing all these things, and didn't figure out my work schedule because I felt there was such a need, and there was. And being the only staff person there at the time that could meet with the women one-on-one, meet with the children one-on-one, meet with the women and children together. After that, we contracted out so that therapists could come in and meet with these families to help, because it's like, I'm dying. I can't do all of this by myself, you know. So then therapists started coming in to help with that process, which was wonderful. Again, the women were there. If they wanted to do restraining order, they had to go out to the DA's office. If they needed to see the therapist, if the therapist didn't come in, they had to go out to see the therapist. Of course, they had to go to school. The children had to go to school. Some women went to school too, those that went to work. And there were safety issues because they were afraid of meeting up, you know, with their abusers either at the courthouse or in the process of going to the school to pick up their children. Whatever the reason might be, they were afraid, you know. If they had outside groups, they were afraid of the fact that they could also encounter their abusers. And so those things were percolating in the minds of, you know, the board and everybody around, you know, in terms of how to make it safer for these women and children. And at the time when it started, it was only for women and children. And so how to make it safer for women and children. And I'm just going to throw out this piece of stats right now. There is one that's very powerful to me, and that is every 9 seconds, a woman in the United States is assaulted. Every 9 seconds. That is huge. 1 in 3 men, would have been assaulted by an intimate partner at some point in his life. That's huge. And it says that domestic violence is a huge problem. It was a huge problem way before our time. It's an age-old problem, and it is still a huge problem in this community, despite all the efforts of everybody trying to come together to see how to best resolve this issue. It is still a huge one. And it doesn't matter whether you're from Milwaukee or you're from anywhere in the United States, it's a worldwide problem. So it's happening in Europe, it's happening in Africa. It's just that the method of managing the issue varies from country to country, from continent to continent. For example, in Africa, in Liberia, I won't speak for the whole continent of Africa, in Liberia, if a man is married to a woman, for example, and he is abusing her, the family jumps in right away and tries to intervene. And if that doesn't work, first time, second time, by the third time, it's like, you know, bring our daughter back to us. You know, you cannot treat her this way. We want her back. So in the traditional setting, they pay dowry, they pay money, they exchange gifts, they give all kinds of gifts, you know, to the family and so forth. We'll give you the money back, we'll give you your gifts back, you know, and so forth. But you cannot treat our daughter like this. Bring her back, we want her back. Here, it's different. You know, nobody's paying dowry, as we know. As we know. Nobody's paying dowry, nobody giving those kinds of gifts, you know, a cow or a bunch of chickens or whatever they do in the traditional society. And so here you definitely can turn to the legal system. Somebody like Kent. Somebody like Kent, you know, you can turn to the legal system to get some help. And that's something that we need to encourage people that are being abused to do. You know, turn to the legal system, involve the police, you know, go to the DA's office and try to get a restraining order. It's a scary process to try to get anyone or someone to intervene or to help you out. It's scary for them, but that's something that has to be done in order for it to stop. The violence doesn't stop on its own. It does not. No amount of promises, you know, I will not do it again, I'm sorry, none of that is going to make it change or make it stop. So intervention has to occur. And what is that intervention? It has to be something like the legal system, for example. Some women, the first place that some women turn, they turn to their pastors, they turn to their parish, they turn to their churches, to their synagogue, and so forth for help. And so these people in these institutions also need to be aware and educated and also be willing to help these people, these individuals that are suffering from domestic violence. So I always say to people, the best way you can help someone who is suffering or being impacted by domestic violence is for you yourself to learn as much as you possibly can about the issues of domestic violence. And that way, if you are informed, you are knowledgeable, you'll be able to help that person and direct them, accordingly. Now, the old shelter, we were there from 1982 up until 2016 was when we moved from this old shelter to the new shelter. But Ken, what brought us to that point? Besides the fact that Kathy Stolpman, that was her dream, and she and other people in the DV arena and the legal system, everyone that touched or was working with domestic violence, were talking about more collaboration, not going for the same pot of money, but doing more for the victims as opposed to for the agency itself. And Ken was very much involved with some of those talks and the processes because he was on the board. And then he was also with the DA's office. And so what are some of your thoughts, Ken, about that?
Yeah, Kathy really got the ball rolling back in about 2006 because of what you just said. We had the Sojourner Truth House that focused mostly on housing women and also provided some counseling for men. We had Task Force on Family Violence that focused on a restraining order clinic, which is very important to connect with the legal system so women could get restraining orders and injunctions, and they would provide the advice for that. You had another agency, Milwaukee Women's Center at the time, that was providing counseling as well, and some shelter. And you had 3 executive directors at that time, all of nearing retirement age, and ironically, when the organization started in the 70s, it was all one organization that then divided into 2 or 3 or then 4 because they all had their focuses that they wished to focus on. And so Kathy, I happened to be the chair of the board at Sojourner at the time, said she was seeing retirement on the horizon for her and thought that it was really important for these agencies, these groups, to start talking about how to better collaborate. At the time, we were very adamant about not seeking to merge with anyone. And Dolly will remember that Kathy and I had a meeting with the staff because we started these conversations. Kathy and I did with the executive directors of these other agencies and their board chairs, and we just talked about what can we do to be more collaborative and to not chase the same dollars and to be more efficient and better provide services to those in need. And I can remember that once that kind of got out, there were concerns about among staff members. Well, does this mean there'll be a merger of organizations, and will that change? Is my job in jeopardy, or what will that look like? And I can remember Kathy and I sitting in front of Dolly and the rest of the staff at Sojourner and saying, "There's not going to be a merger of anything. This is not about a merger. This is just about collaboration." And we were very clear about that. Except then as this year went on, 2006 and 2007, I'd moved in a position in the DA's office where I occupy now, so I was in a position of driving policy and some other things, and so I was became acquainted with the concept of a movement around the country called the Family Justice Center that was co-locating police and prosecutors and social workers together in one place. And the first one started in San Diego, and other iterations of this started in some big cities. And so a local philanthropist said to me that he would help fund us studying this, and he brought in people from San Diego to come to Milwaukee, and we assembled a group of people around the community to talk, who had interest in this issue, and started having these meetings, monthly, and a whole study process was done in 2007 and into 2008 to just see whether we'd be ready for something like this. A group of us went out to San Diego for the National Conference of Family Justice Centers in early 2008. A group of us from Milwaukee and saw what was being done in San Diego and other cities. And the one thing that struck us was, what we had in Milwaukee for a long time, in my office and in the court system, we've had 3 dedicated domestic violence courts for a long time in Milwaukee. And we have in my office a unit of prosecutors. Now we're up to 11 and soon to be 12 prosecutors in my office who do nothing but domestic violence cases. That's their whole caseload. And I was in that unit as a young prosecutor, and so I knew what that was like. I did that for a couple of years, and got this when I became acquainted with Sojourner and joined the board. And you could see the inefficiencies in the system because we were trying to do things, and then I can remember as a young prosecutor giving referral slips to 6 or 7 places to women who would come to our office and talk to me about their situation, and then they'd leave. And I just kept thinking, what's the likelihood that these 6 or 7 places will be accessed by this mom with her kids in a time of duress? How is that ever going to really work? And so when we heard about this model that was being employed around the country, we thought this could be something that really works here. The difference we decided we needed, though, because we already had the dedicated domestic violence courts and the prosecutors, and in Wisconsin we have a mandatory arrest law, so police are required to arrest when they respond to when they respond to a domestic violence incident. They're required to arrest someone if there's probable cause, and that person's on the scene. Many times that person's not there after they commit the act. So we had a lot of pieces in place on the law enforcement side and in the court system side that a lot of these places we were seeing around the country were really big on police and prosecutors. So like 2/3 of the center that they would build would be full of law enforcement, and about 1/3 would be full of social workers. And we'd go to these buildings, and they would be like in city halls, or they would be in police buildings, or there would be one wing of social workers and the nice wallpaper and the painting and the little playroom and all of that, kind of surrounded by offices. And we thought, well, that's not going to work for us because we don't need that here. We've got the law enforcement piece. It's not perfect, I can assure you of that, but it's good and it's robust. And we felt like what we needed was something different that would be much more warm and welcoming and much more focused on the therapeutic piece of this. Because, I've been at it so long now that what you realize is that you can't continue to run people through our system over and over again. Very few people, we heard from the Department of, from Lincoln Hills, from Amy a couple weeks ago. She was terrific. And one of the things about Department of Corrections is most people who go through the Department of Corrections and go to prison, about 2/3 of them end up back in prison again. And that's just, there is a real cycle of that gets hard to break. So we were thinking about how to take a much more therapeutic approach with our model here in Milwaukee and really fill it with people like Dolly as opposed to people like me, and people like Dolly who could reach victims and their children and actually have a chance of helping them form a pathway for themselves to see how they could become a productive, contributing, safe member in a healthy community, right? And so that's really kind of what our vision was. And I'll show you a couple other things about what we did then at the time. We got a lot of help along the way. We did some studies, and ultimately our boards at Sojourner Truth House and at the Task Force on Family Violence met, and we talked about what should this look like? Should we be 2 organizations? And ultimately our board members, many of them, some of our large donors, some of you knew Jerry and Elaine Mayman. They were terrific, generous people to Sojourner over the years and active in the Episcopal Diocese. And Jerry, I can remember saying to Angela Mancuso and to me at the time, well, why shouldn't you be merging? Why shouldn't you be doing that? Isn't that the right thing to do? And so we came around to that actually being the right thing to do, as interesting and kind of difficult as that process was. So Sojourner and Task Force merged in 2007 into 2008, and we then started a capital campaign that, let me just go back to a couple of these. So this was a chart done by one of the consultants we had that mapped the entire system, criminal justice, domestic violence, providers, all of this, and these were all of the things, family court and restraining orders and the sheriff and how all of this happens. And you can just see this is what we impose upon people to go and try to make themselves safe, right? We're all here if you can come to my shop, and we're happy to help you if you can get here. And so the vision became this, where we had everybody located not in my building, which is not a very forgiving place to be, by the way, and into a center where people would actually feel welcome and would want to come to. And the idea was co-locating all of these agencies in some form or fashion in a warm, welcoming place. One of the interesting things that was new about our center, was the first time done in the country, was that you can see up there Child Protection Center. That's provided by Children's Hospital of Wisconsin, and they provide all the services related to child abuse. They do the interviews, and they have counselors on site, and they do the medical forensic piece of that too, which is so critical. And so Carmen and I approached Peggy Troy at the time. It was just very new as the CEO and president of Children's, and she's tremendous. And for those of you who know her, she was just immediately, she and her executive team really picked up on this idea of what could we do if we co-located what you do too, because oftentimes we were finding that women would not want to report domestic violence because they were worried about having their kids taken away from them. And that's something my office does too at Children's Court. So there was a real deterrent against that. And so what we were trying to say is, look, this is not about trying to take anyone's children away from anyone. These are the warning signs. And this is what happens, Mom, if you don't do something. So if you're not, maybe you're willing to work with this, but this is impacting your children. And this is this is really the idea of it. As I always said, the idea behind building this was not to send more cases and create more prosecutions in the DA's office, but ultimately down the road to create fewer, because the idea would be that we were helping them families receive that therapeutic intervention that they need. So
Create a one-stop shop.
That's right, exactly right. So these are a lot of the services. Sojourners had the 24-hour hotline forever. We now have sexual assault treatment services provided by Aurora. Not always all of them there, but if a woman is in need of that, she can get that access right there. We have prosecutors from my office there. We have victim advocates from my office there. The police department has a group of sensitive crimes and domestic violence investigators at the site now. And Jewish Family Services provides ongoing groups. And then these are some of the partners. And some of this is about then, helping move forward with, like the school system, for example. How's the child doing in school? And the idea was when Mom comes in with children, remember, she can live, the shelter is on site here, so she can come and stay for as long as she needs to with her children, but we need kids to be in school, we need them to be re-engaged. So part of this was also about sort of taking an inventory of how the family was doing and how the children were doing in school, and what could we do to try to prevent them from cycling back into the using of our system again, over and over again. So this was a time frame. We ultimately broke ground in 2014. We looked at dozens and dozens of properties. The idea was that, and the one that we had the photo of on Highland was private, was confidential, although you knew it wasn't really confidential, right? Because people could find it, right?
So I think people kind of respected it, or they were afraid of the police, but it didn't come. 10 times out of the entire time we're there, the people show up. And we had this little script, that we would say, you're trespassing, we don't know what you're talking about, please leave. If you don't, we'll call the police. So we never had any issue there, except once when someone did a bomb threat, and then the police got involved, and so forth. But the news center, we were kind of afraid of going from the secret environment, the confidential location, to a location where the address would be public. And we kind of wonder, how would that be safe for the clients, the residents, the residential ones? Because Sojourner at this building was serving residential on one end and non-residential on the other end. And so we were concerned about that. Also, our mindset coming from 33rd and Highland and the secrecy of the location is like, all of a sudden now it's going to be public. Everybody's going to be showing up here. How are we going to manage this and so forth? And me being the director, the staff turned to me. How do you think we're going to manage this? I said, this too. Kathy Stokman used to always say, this too shall pass. So, so I picked that up. This too will pass. We will deal with it. We'll work with it. Staff was always involved with all the discussions that were going on, with the whole process of starting this beautiful shelter.
Right. So this is at 6th and Walnut, and the front street here is 6th Street. This angled is, excuse me, the street going north-south is 6th Street, and this faces on Walnut. This shelter is 72,000 square feet, which at the time it was built is the largest in the nation. I've since been told that because they do everything bigger in Texas, that there's a bigger one in Texas now.
Yes,
in fact, Carmen and I
yes.
were presenting at a national program, several years ago with some folks from Texas, and the guy, we weren't talking about how big the shelter was, but the guy who introduced us talked about it. This is the biggest in the country, and we're just, Midwestern, sure, that's fine. But the folks next to us in Texas is like, well, we're building an addition, and we're going to be bigger in about a year. So, and I think they've done that. So kudos to them.
And with the whole bigger idea going with that, people were saying, well, how large do you want the shelter to be? Asking the staff. And we were saying, well, we have 36, beds here, 38 at the most. Well, we certainly don't want it to be so big that it becomes institutionalized and it loses that welcoming and home-type family feeling. And so we decided on 54 beds.
Mm-hmm. The nice thing is they're all on one level,
yes,
right?
all on one, no bunk beds, all on one level.
And you can the rooms can be fitted to fit children and families, because we were seeing more of those.
Yes,
right?
Instead of 10 rooms, it became 21 bedrooms with 7 single rooms. But guess what? Everybody wanted to be in their own room, in a single room, and that just could not work. Because if you had children, only one bed was in that room. It was only for single women. So then, to mention real quick, the rooms all have names. And the question was, what do we name the names of the bedrooms in the shelter? So some people were saying, oh, we could say the diamond room, the gold room, the silver room. And it's like, wait a minute. So if we go with diamond and all that jewelry, and we put someone in the gold room, we put someone in the diamond room, someone will more than likely come up with, well, why am I not in the diamond room? I want to be in the diamond room. I said to myself, nobody got time to be fooling with all that. I want to be in the diamond, I want to be in the gold, and so forth. So I said, staff, how about if we name the rooms after Sojourner's children? I said, that way, nobody's going to have a problem with that. Where did the names come from? Sojourner's children. So we researched the names of our children, and we named the rooms after, at least the ones we could find. We named them, and we ran out of name, and so we named one of the rooms Sojourner. And of course, that room, a lot of people wanted to be in the Sojourner room, and they could only accommodate one woman.
So this is a rendering, artist rendering of the dining hall in particular, which faces down to the south and to the east. And I wish I had a photo from that room, because it's a $1 million view of downtown.
Yes.
It's a $1 million view. It's up on the hill here a bit, and you see the Fiserv, and you see the entire skyline, surrounded by these windows where residents dine each and every day and convene as a group. And I think it's just a really inspiring place. When you think about wanting it to be a place, this is an actual photo, of course. You think about it wanting to be a place where somebody can collect themselves and try to figure out how to move forward. I think the architects, you saw those words earlier, a lot of those descriptive words up there. That's what the architects had us all do together to describe what we wanted the place to look like and how we wanted people to feel when they came in. And all these words like hope and warmth and welcoming and secure and safety and beauty. And so these are some of the interior photos. This is the
Call center, the children's play area, and this is coming down into the shelter.
There's a big play space outside too that's secured with fencing around it, a big playground on the outside of it as well. Police department's in there, my office is in there. I would say that this is just I'm going to touch on it because I know we only have a few minutes left to present, but one of the things they told us early on was that we thought they did a feasibility study, and for Sojourner to raise money, I think they estimated they thought we would raise $5 million or so. So that wasn't really optimistic about building a building. But then our relationship with Children's Hospital really changed the whole game for us, because Peggy was so interested in co-locating her services here, and then she was interested in lending her influence with the state. In every budget cycle, the state provides money through the building commission for large projects that benefit many people in the state. And so it happened to be in 2012 that Peggy every year Children's Hospital, or every cycle, was often asking for something, a clinic or something else. And her ask of the state in the year we had marshaled enough funds and had the plans sort of drawn, in theory anyway, was for the state to provide half of the building expense for this. And she said, this will be our only Children's Hospital ask for this whole year. And it was for Sojourner. And, they only occupy, a third of it or 20% of it. And this was her ask for Sojourner. $10.5 million is what the state contributed to this. And that was half the building cost, which was $21 million. And we raised another $5 million to help pay for operating costs moving forward. So it was a really incredible, a lot of incredibly generous people like we have in Milwaukee, and institutions came forward to try to make this a reality. I was going to talk a little bit about this, but since we only have a couple more minutes, what I just did want to discuss a little bit about all these great services going on we were seeing prior to COVID was an increase of people connecting with Sojourner. The number of cases we were prosecuting was about the same, but the good part was we had more engagement with victims in our cases, which is critical because often if at some point, and we understand all the reasons why a woman may not wish to follow through with prosecution, then our cases fall apart. They literally do, and we can't move forward. So we were seeing really high levels of engagement, and then, of course, with the pandemic, it's been very difficult, like with everybody. And so there's been, we were talking about, I think the mantra was at one point with the pandemic early on, safer at home, and we were all saying, well, not necessarily. And that's just a fact. And that's not a criticism of anything. We had to respond to a very difficult health situation. But unfortunately, as these things do, people who were already vulnerable at the beginning are vanquished sometimes in this, and this is what's happened here. And so there's been a real decline in the number. We still have plenty of people accessing Sojourner, but the decline from 8,000 to like 5,000 at its very low, and commensurately then, this is per year, and then a commensurate increase in domestic violence homicides that we've seen that we're still really trying to get a handle on. So now the numbers are ticking upward again. You retired in 2019, so you retired right before the pandemic. And and so it's been difficult. There's no question about that. Now things are still, our prosecutors are back at, but you can see some of these services just decreased just because people weren't accessing, and then you can see that bottom number, DV homicide, just going right up. And to me, it really illustrates that the way through a number of these public safety issues is to take a much more of a public health approach, and you think about, how can you collaborate with the people who can provide services, and we're the backstop, but how do we help people think about what their path forward is toward becoming healthy, which is not an easy thing to do. But that, to me, really underscores the value and the strength of collaboration. And, we've been fragmented, frankly, in the last 3 years, and that's made everything difficult, as we know. So a lot of stuff was virtual and has been. They're returning a lot of that to on-site. As I said, the police have been there, and my prosecutors are back there, and a lot of the social workers are in the place. The one thing I do want to finish with, because I think it is important, is that's the domestic violence status. So this is one thing that we really focused on was how do we figure out if this is working or not? Because conceptually this sounds great, and I do think there are efficiencies that have truly been gained here. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But one of the things that studies have increasingly demonstrated that if people have an increased sense of hope in their lives, that their prospects for better health and better safety and just a better future for themselves, that there's a direct correlation between those two metrics. And so this is a team from Children's and with Sojourner who have focused directly on outcomes and by interviewing the clients who've come through here. And they've developed a hope scale that basically talks about hope over time, over the period of a year. And on a scale of 8, 5.6 would be the rating early on, and then on average it's increased by a full point after 12 months. And for some, that's obviously higher. And we think that really becomes really has to be the touch point that you think about, because it's about we're trying to people like Dolly and all the people she's trained and who are still there are trying to help people come up with their own vision of how they fit in the world here, right? And they have to formulate that, and they have to, with support, they have to be the ones that take those hard steps. And it's not easy, but you can't You can't do that without some belief that you have the power to do it. I know some will say that hope is not a strategy, and that is true enough. But there is no successful strategy without hope and without a belief in that strategy being implemented. And so this is about kind of the mindset that we want the families that come through our place to feel and to serve and to build, with the idea that they're shaping what their future looks like with the help of all of us. And these are some of the quotes that clients have said in their studies about how they now view their ability to move forward after having very, very difficult situations they've encountered. So we were hoping to have some Q&A, and we'll stay. I see it's 10 till noon right now, but so we should probably stop. But I just want to thank all of you for being here today, and we certainly take any questions, or if people need to leave, we can stick around too. Yeah, Betsy.
Yeah, I want to thank you both for your professionalism as well as your heart in this really delicate matter. Looking at the really huge picture, this affects all segments of society, not just one, in all places in the world. What can we be doing differently other than breaking the cycle to have this be a smaller problem rather than a bigger problem?
Huge one. What can we do? Okay, like I said earlier. Sorry, thank you for reminding me. Like I said earlier, to begin with, you're doing it right now by learning all you can possibly learn about domestic violence and this huge issue. And so if we start from that standpoint, learning about it first, that's a start. And then getting involved, Sojourner is there. And at some point, I mentioned earlier that they utilize volunteers. At some point, they will be doing that again. So that's one way of helping to break this silence. I mean, this whole cycle of domestic violence by getting involved yourself in some shape or form. What other ways?
One thing to keep in mind, I think, is that when we focus a lot as a community on violent crime in the community, or what young people are doing, and the reality is it's something that I learned early on in my prosecution days. After prosecuting domestic violence cases, then I was prosecuting firearms cases and gang cases, and we were really taking a very hard line around possession of a firearm by a felon. You were going to prison no matter what. Johnny Cochran ads were everywhere at that time, and then we were looking back at the histories and seeing that almost every one of these young people, and we were prosecuting 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds. We thought we'd be prosecuting 30-year-olds. We were prosecuting very young men, and many of them were abused or neglected as children. And then if you look back, their mom was a domestic violence victim that we had prosecuted her offender in the system. It seems basic, right? But the reality is that this is what I think triggered in my mind, certainly, the need to. We have to keep thinking, moving upstream in the life cycle of a family, in the life cycle of a neighborhood, and all of those things. Strong families create strong neighborhoods, and it has a rippling effect. But the opposite is true also, and it's got to be this continued focus. And it's not a kinder world we're living in either right now, right? That's a tough thing to work on. Is how do we all in our own daily lives, express that or help spread it, because it's a harsh world in the way we communicate with one another today, and
it's terrible nowadays. It's terrible.
Yeah, so it's tough.
Listen to how people talk to each other. Language is powerful, it's huge, and so we have to be careful what we say, to each other, what we say to people. It can make a person so tall, and it can make a person this small. So we have to be very careful. We have to also try to reach out to the children, and at Sojourner, we've talked about that over a period of time, and that's something that Carmen still wants to do, and that's to make inroads into the school system, so that children from kindergarten level, because they're so impressionable, they hear and they say what they hear, and they do what they see, so they really need to be reached from that level, from kindergarten all the way up. So we need to make some inroads into the school system and start to educate and retrain the thinking of these kids. Hopefully that will help to break the cycle. Mm-hmm. But that's a huge one, because I know, for example, MPS is a system that's hard to go, to get into. But little by little, you know, you start with the ones that you can reach, and then hopefully you can reach the unreachable. Any other questions?
With the improvement on new resources, how's the affordability changed? Because I'm still a lot for you get like retained beds and all of the different areas in your facility. How can this next time afford this movement?
Oh, all the services to them are free. Yes, they don't pay 1 cent to stay there. So they know this before they even come in, that they wouldn't be charged for anything. So we don't even ask them to make a donation. If they want to, they can. You know, they don't use, when clients used to leave, upon leaving, they say, oh, I want to make a little donation. It's like you starting your life all over. Sojourner will be here. Once you are stable and in a better place, then you can always make a donation to Sojourner, but don't do it right now. So everything is free to them because they've left home and they've come to us with nothing. A lot of times with no shoes on their feet, only the clothes on their back because it's a safety issue and they have run away from their homes and left everything behind. So if you were to think about running away from your home because you were trying to be safe and leaving everything behind, think about how you would feel. And you end up in a new place, strange people, living with strange people, and strange people working with you. So that's something for you to think about. How would you feel? How would you manage that? So it's putting yourself in the position or in the shoes of those women and children and men, because this new shelter now takes men, women, and children. And that's another big difference from the old one to the new one, because this is a problem for everyone, not just women and children, but it's also a men's issue. Men are being abused as well.
And so how does Sojourner do it? They do it through the support of the community. The community is really generous, but a lot of what Sojourner has to do is fundraise. That's a big part of keeping the operations going. And it was, you know, we knew at the beginning it'd be a heavy lift because we were trying to elevate the response here and really provide something that we wanted to provide dignity to people who maybe hadn't felt much dignity in their lives, and we wanted it to be a warm place for them to come to, and that costs money. So the reality is we're fortunate that the community is very generous, but it's an ongoing, every year Sojourner has to, you know, fundraise a substantial amount of its budget in order to pay to have something at a, you know, a really nice level for people who deserve that. It's a good question.
So come to the Taste of Africa. Susan, I see you. Come to the Taste of Africa in November, November 2nd. That's a way to support.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, during COVID time, it went down to 43 in terms of capacity because, you know, people had to spread out and respect that distance and so forth. Now it's back up, so you can easily have like 60 people living under the roofs. When I was there, when we moved there, it was like 60 people. You know, a lot of times we had the capacity of 60. Because it's shared, you know, I mentioned it's 7 rooms that are single, but then the rest of the rooms, that would be what, 14?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 14 family rooms that could accommodate women and children.
Yeah, one advantage of the design now is that it can stay occupied to its fullest extent. One of the problems we were starting to have, as Dolly alluded to, at the Highland location was because of bunk beds and on the second floor and families that weren't conducive to sharing with other families, that we often weren't occupied to 100% because just the layout of the place wasn't conducive, and some families were just choosing not to be there. But it's back up to essentially almost 100% occupancy now. Right, and the average stay, Dolly, what, 60 days or so? 30 to 60 to 90 days, depending?
Yes, depending. And the thing is, most, Oh, Lord. Most people, you don't dock me for this now. Most people want to leave, when it's time for them to leave, when they feel ready to leave. And so we try to help them be ready for that moment when they are moving into, hopefully, somewhere else. Either going into a new apartment or moving with a family member that they couldn't live with before, but that is now willing to, accept them. Then there will always be a time when some people won't want to leave because they feel so secured and so comfortable and so safe, in this environment, especially if you've never experienced that in a lifetime. And those are the ones that we have to keep an eye on and really, work with and encourage, and try to put maybe in a transitional living program so that they can, have another layer of help and protection. Yes.
There must be times, though, where there's a really
Yes, that happens. So if there is no room for that person, then we look to what's available in the community. So for example, Waukesha has a shelter, and both places refer back and forth and transport, through cabs and so forth, transport the clients back and forth. Milwaukee Women's Refuge, that's another shelter that takes not only homeless, but also domestic violence victims as well, survivors. And so, yeah, we refer to what's available in the community. And if it's really necessary, then people are put up in a hotel. And so they sleep there and then come to the shelter, for programming and whatever interaction and so forth. And then nighttime, they are transported back to the hotel to sleep. So there are ways to work around that, and that's why money is so necessary. Yes. Yes. The first program for abusers was started by Sojourner. And Sojourner has that. And that was part of the reason, too, for moving from Wisconsin Avenue. Besides the fact that it outgrew the space, they also saw that it needed to provide something for the abusers. And the abusers and the victims could not be under the same roof. And so they needed to move the shelter someplace else. That was the other reason. So those were the two reasons. And so once the shelter moved to 33rd and Highland, the abuser program stayed on 31st and Wisconsin, and then later on moved someplace else. But now, currently, Sojourner doesn't have that program anymore. Carmen turned it over to
The Alma Center.
the Alma Center because of the focus being on women and children at this point, as opposed to, only as opposed to the abusers, because they have been doing it for many, many years too, the Alma Center, and they do a great job with that. So she thought she would let them do that, and then Sojourner concentrate on, this piece here, restraining orders, women and children in shelters, and so forth.
Yeah, the interesting thing about therapy for abusers is that modality's changed over time from being something that would be the classic, you sit people down in a group, men down in a group, and you explain the power and control dynamic that they're employing here and how wrong that is, and how, in a very direct, tough message, important and all true, and I'm not, but I think what has developed over time, and Alma specializes in this, is taking a much more trauma-informed approach to it, understanding that so many abusers were abused themselves as children,
Yes.
or watched abuse going on among the adults in their household. And it's about, we have to unpack that before we, really condemn or educate on the act of the power and control with so many of these people. So that's really the approach taken. And then we work with them in my office to incentivize men going through the Alma Center program. We have a direct program for the lower level incidents that are misdemeanor level. So if a man goes through that program, which is in several months, it's not just a weekend or a couple weeks. They'll receive some sort of, and they've completed it and they're engaged. They'll receive some sort of benefit on their charge with regard to our office too, because from our standpoint, it's important for people to get that therapeutic intervention. Okay, well, I know we're over time. Thank you so much today for your attention. Appreciate it.